The memo is dated July 1977. It is marked for internal distribution only. It is not a press release, not a policy document, not a public statement of any kind. It is a scientific briefing prepared by a senior researcher at Exxon's Corporate Research Division for the company's management committee, the men who run one of the largest corporations on Earth. The memo states, in the careful language of a scientist speaking to executives, that the burning of fossil fuels is introducing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate that will, over the coming decades, raise global temperatures to levels that could have catastrophic consequences for a significant fraction of the Earth's population. The management committee reads the memo. They commission further research. Over the next several years, Exxon will spend millions of dollars building one of the most sophisticated climate research programs in the world, mounting instruments on supertankers to measure CO2 in the open ocean, running computer models of atmospheric warming, producing findings that will, decades later, be confirmed as among the most accurate early climate projections ever made. And then, in the early 1980s, Exxon will make a different kind of decision. The debate over climate change is usually framed as a conflict between science and denial, between those who understood what was happening and those who did not. That framing is wrong. Because the most important actors in the story of climate denial were not people who failed to understand the science. They were people who funded the science, read the science, confirmed the science internally, and then spent the next 4 decades telling the public the science was uncertain. What Exxon did between 1977 and the present day is not a story about ignorance. It is a story about knowledge, and what powerful institutions do when knowledge threatens their business model. To understand what Exxon knew, you have to understand who Exxon was. By the mid-1970s, Exxon, then known as Esso, a descendant of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, was one of the most profitable companies in the history of capitalism. It operated in over 100 countries. Its annual revenues exceeded the GDP of most nations. It employed some of the best scientists and engineers in the world, not as decoration but as operational necessity. Because finding, extracting, and refining oil at the scale Exxon operated required genuine scientific excellence. In 1957, a subsidiary of what would become Exxon had already commissioned an internal study on the greenhouse effect. The findings were noted and filed. By the early 1970s, the broader scientific community was beginning to coalesce around a concerning signal in the atmospheric data. CO2 concentrations, measured continuously since 1958 at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, were rising in a curve so consistent and so steep that its implications were becoming difficult to ignore. Exxon was watching. In 1977, a senior scientist named James Black delivered a briefing to Exxon's management committee that would later be described by historians as one of the most consequential internal corporate presentations of the 20th century. Black told the executives directly, the scientific evidence strongly suggested that burning fossil fuels was warming the planet. The warming was likely to accelerate. And if it did, the consequences, rising seas, disrupted agriculture, extreme weather would be severe. The executives did not dismiss him, they funded him. Between 1978 and the mid-1980s, Exxon ran what its own researchers privately called a first-class research program on climate science. They equipped a supertanker, the Esso Atlantic, with instruments to measure CO2 concentrations in the open ocean. They built in-house computer models projecting atmospheric warming under different emissions scenarios. They corresponded with leading academic climate scientists. They produced internal reports of genuine scientific rigor. One 1982 internal document, marked confidential and prepared for senior management, projected that a doubling of atmospheric CO2 would raise global temperatures by approximately 1.3 to 3.1 degrees Celsius. The actual scientific consensus today places that figure at between 2.5 and 4 degrees. Exxon's 1982 internal estimate was not just in the right ballpark. It was precise, and it was marked confidential. In 1981, a senior manager named Roger Cohen circulated a memo that captured the moment the company stood at a crossroads. Cohen wrote that the results of Exxon's research were unlikely to be reassuring to the corporation. He noted that if the company's own projections were correct, the world would face a choice between dramatic reductions in fossil fuel use or dramatic consequences, and that either outcome represented a significant threat to Exxon's long-term business model. The research program did not end immediately, but it began to change. Through the early 1980s, Exxon quietly began to redirect its internal climate work. Funding for the research program was scaled back. Scientists who had been running atmospheric models found their projects deprioritized. The supertanker measurements were wound down. By 1983, Exxon's public posture on climate science had begun to shift in a direction its internal documents did not support. Company representatives began to emphasize uncertainty. The idea that the science was not yet settled, that more research was needed before any policy response could be justified. This was not a reflection of what Exxon's scientists had found. It was a reflection of what Exxon's executives had decided. In 1988, NASA scientist James Hansen testified before Congress that global warming was already underway, a moment that pushed climate change into mainstream public debate for the first time. The same year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established. The science was moving toward consensus. Exxon's response was not to share what it knew. It was to fund the opposite. Beginning in the late 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s, Exxon became one of the largest corporate funders of climate skepticism in the world. It channeled money, documented amounts exceeding $30 million, with credible estimates of the total much higher, to a network of think tanks, advocacy organizations, and individual researchers whose primary output was the production of public doubt. The Global Climate Coalition, the American Petroleum Institute, the George C. Marshall Institute, the Heartland Institute, organizations whose public function was to argue that the science of climate change was contested, incomplete, and insufficient to justify regulatory action. Many of their core talking points, the emphasis on natural climate variability, the questioning of computer model reliability, the demand for more research before any policy response, were arguments that Exxon's own internal scientists had already examined and rejected years earlier. The company was funding, in public, the dismantling of conclusions it had already reached, in private. The exposure came slowly, then all at once. In 2015, two investigative journalism outlets, Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times, working independently, published simultaneous investigations based on internal Exxon documents. The documents included the 1977 Black Briefing, The 1982 confidential projections, the Cohen memo, and years of internal correspondence that showed, in the company's own words, the gap between what it knew and what it said. Attorneys general in multiple states opened investigations. The New York Attorney General issued a subpoena. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an inquiry. Academic researchers published peer-reviewed analyses comparing Exxon's internal projections to its public statements and found systematic and deliberate divergence. Exxon's legal and communications teams responded with the same strategy the company had used for decades: deny, deflect, emphasize uncertainty. In 2019, the New York case went to trial. Exxon won on the specific securities fraud charge, but the trial had produced something the company could not control: a public record. Thousands of internal documents entered into evidence. Years of private correspondence made visible. The gap between internal knowledge and external messaging documented in detail that no corporate communications team could fully manage. In 2023, a landmark climate liability case in Montana found that the state government had violated its constitutional duty to protect a clean environment. Dozens of similar cases were moving through courts across the United States and internationally. The legal reckoning was not complete, but the documents were out, and the documents said what they said. There is a calculation at the center of this story that is worth sitting with. Exxon's scientists in 1982 projected that serious consequences from climate change would begin to manifest in the mid-21st century, roughly around now. They were right. The warming is happening. The seas are rising. The weather is shifting in patterns that match, with uncomfortable precision, what those internal models projected. The question is not whether the science was correct. The science was correct. Exxon's own scientists confirmed it was correct before most of the world had heard the term global warming. The question is what 40 years of manufactured doubt cost. 40 years in which the window for the least disruptive policy response steadily narrowed. 40 years in which every international climate negotiation was complicated by the presence of organized, well-funded skepticism that Exxon and its industry partners had engineered. 40 years in which governments that might have acted earlier were given political cover to delay by the argument that the science was not yet settled. The science was settled in Exxon's own offices in 1977. This is the mechanism that makes the story of Exxon different from a story of ordinary corporate misconduct. It is not simply that a company caused harm and tried to hide it. It is that the harm was preventable, and the prevention was specifically, deliberately, expensively obstructed by the people best positioned to prevent it. There is a word for the period between when a problem becomes known and when it is acted upon. Policy researchers call it the implementation gap. In the case of climate change, that gap was not accidental. It was manufactured, at a cost of tens of millions of dollars, by people who had read the science, funded the science, confirmed the science, and then decided that their quarterly earnings mattered more than the conclusions their own researchers had reached. The memo from 1977 still exists. It sits in an archive, precisely dated, precisely worded, marked for internal distribution only. A scientist telling a room full of executives what was coming. A room full of executives deciding what to do with what they had just heard. The decision they made is not ancient history. We are living in it right now.